human dignity. He says in his book on human rights, anyone who professes to take rights seriously must accept, at the minimum, the vague but powerful idea of human dignity. Now, I agree with Dworkin about human dignity. I imagine everybody in this room would agree with what he says about human dignity. And this is not just the acceptance of an idea, it is the recognition in practice of the dignity of particular people, of each particular person. And I suggest there is, in all moral decision-making, an inescapable element of sheer recognition, a recognition that other human beings have value in themselves for themselves. In 1511, Bartolomé de las Casas heard a sermon by a Dominican preacher who, referring to the local Indian population in Latin America who were being enslaved and ill-treated, asked the congregation, "Are they not men? Are you not bound to love them as yourselves?" And it was the same issue that Shylock posed to his Christian tormentors in Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. And most even in the world has been brought about because of this failure of recognition, when sometimes whole peoples have been regarded as disposable. Now, if at the heart of morality there is this matter of recognition, then obviously the question arises about the relationship between this and moral reasoning, the importance of which has been stressed so strongly by Dworkin. Now, what I would suggest is that moral reasoning, of course, is absolutely essential, but in the end, it can be no substitute from a point of recognition at some point in the argument. We can all recognize that if someone says, "Why do you love me?" and they receive the reply, "Because of your fabulous car," this may be a reason, but it's not one going to satisfy the person who asked the question. If they receive the reply, "I love you because of your beautiful body," they may be half satisfied, but if they then respond by saying, "But what happens when I get old? I want you to love me for myself," we're likely to sympathize with them. Reasons may reflect a fundamental recognition about the worth of the other, and indeed they should, but they cannot be a substitute for it, nor can they be guaranteed to bring it about. To say, "I love your smile, your face, your hair," can all reflect the fact that you love, the person is loved for themselves. And these are features of that self, which is love. But to say, "I love you because of your face," and leave it at that, is surely ambiguous. The highest form of love is to love someone for themselves just because they are themselves. Reasons can help to elucidate it or express this, but they cannot be a substitute for it. And I think this is brilliantly brought out in a play by the Irish writer Frank McGuinness called "There Came a Gypsy Riding By." In this play, a family meet together on the anniversary of their son Jean's suicide. And they're given a note he wrote, but this note is totally blank. It gives no indication at all as to why he'd taken his own life. So they're doubly distressed. First of all, the fact that their dearly loved son has taken his own life. And secondly, he gave absolutely no reason for it. And then the father says to his wife, "I looked into his coffin the morning of his funeral. I said something to him that nobody heard. I've not told you nor the other children. I told him if I were given one wish, I would go back in time to before he was born, and I wouldn't change him. I would still choose him. I would not change my child, no matter what." Now, it seems to me those words express a fundamental appreciation of someone being of worth and value simply as they are for themselves. And as I've suggested, reasons can elucidate and evoke that act of recognition, but they cannot guarantee to bring it about. Now, the Roman Catholic philosopher Herbert McCabe has a rather nice analogy about watching ice skating on television, which helps to elucidate, I think, the relationship between this recognition and reasoning. He was watching television with his friend, watching ice skating, in fact, and this ice skating made Herbert McCabe say, "Marvelous, lovely, beautiful." Now, it happened that the friend who was with him was an expert on ice skating, and was equally full of phrase, but talked about it in terms of double sal chows, the toilet salutes, reverse wally jumps, and other technical terms that I'd never heard of before, probably you'd never heard of either. McCabe expressed his value judgments, but the expert described what it was to be a good skater. And as McCabe says, he expressed his view that something was good precisely by describing what it was. In this case, the account of what it was an account, and the best account of it being good. In a similar way, we can give an account of what it is to be a good person. So it would be very odd if good skater could be spelt out in terms of what good skaters can or cannot do, whereas good person were merely an expression of my feelings or desires. Now, I think this helps to make sense of the fact, which we're all very warily aware of, that you don't have to be a philosopher or an intellectual to make right moral judgments. Some of the most moving stories that came out of World War II were simple farmers who hid Jews who were fleeing, literally, too often than not, at the cost of their own lives. We also know that some moral philosophers supported the Nazi creed, and countless intellectuals in Germany were morally blind to what is going on. And one of the most moving stories for me that came out of the war was precisely this: a farmer who'd sheltered a Jewish family, and after the war, when he was interviewed about what he'd done and why he'd done it, he simply replied, "Well, why do you ask?" It was obvious to him what needed to do. He needed no reason, religious or philosophical. They simply recognized what was right, and unfortunately not so usual, did it almost instinctively. Now, in saying this, I'm in no way undermining the importance of moral reasoning or moral philosophy or any other kind of philosophy, but I do think we need to hold in mind the fact that the simplest, least intellectual people can very often make right moral judgments, and those of us who are more intellectual can sometimes make wrong ones, and we have to account for that as well. Now, I suggested earlier on that the first moral conviction that Dworkin has is the dignity of other people, one which would be shared by all of us. The second foundational conviction is not quite so usual. It's quite interesting, because it is for him what he calls the concept of living well and having a good life. And by that, he doesn't just mean living it up and pleasure. He means, as it goes on, he recognizes that there is something mysterious about the human sense of wanting to live well. That is, to live a life, this is how he defines it, to live a life we can take pride in. In a way, for instance, that we don't simply take pride in wanting to eat and drink. He says, we are charged to live well by the bare fact of our existence as self-conscious creatures with lives to lead. It is important that we live well, not just important to us or anyone else, but just important. Now, I fully accept, in line with my earlier line of argument, that this sense of wanting to live well belongs to humanity as such and doesn't require in any logical sense a prior religious justification. However, what I would like to suggest is that the concept of interpretation, which is fundamental to Dworkin's whole position, allows us to interpret our human experience in the widest and most coherent, consistent manner possible. And this is what a religious interpretation of life seeks to do. Because, if you like, why do we have this profound conviction that it's important to live our lives well, to live our lives in such a way that we can take pride in them? And I think, as I said, I don't believe that in any of the traditional arguments for the existence of God, but I think what we can say is that if we set this fundamental conviction within a wider theistic framework, you can see how it all hangs together and makes sense. Now, there's no reason why the universe should make sense. And that was, as I understand it, Kant's main point. There's no reason why the universe should make overall sense. But I think few people would deny that if there is a good God who's created life good, who's given us this sense of this capacity for moral discernment, who's given us this kind of conviction that we need to live lives that we can take pride in, it makes sense against the background of an ultimate, a God to whom we are ultimately accountable. Now, Dworkin ends his book with a moving paragraph that brings together his whole theme, political and personal. It says, the justice we've imagined begins in what seems like an unchallengeable proposition, because he's really fundamentally concerned with political philosophy as well as moral philosophy, that government must treat those under its dominion with equal concern and respect. That justice does not threaten, it expands our liberty, does not trade freedom for equality or the other way round, does not cripple enterprise for the sake of cheats. It favours neither big nor small government, but only just government. It is drawn from dignity and aims at dignity. It makes it easier and more likely for each of us to live a good life. That's the second of his moral convictions. Remember, too, that the stakes are more than mortal. Without dignity, our lives are only blinks of duration. But if we manage to live a good life well, we create something more. We write a subscript to our mortality. We make our lives tiny diamonds in the cosmic sands. Now that's a very moving, very noble statement, isn't it? We make our lives tiny diamonds in the cosmic sands. But for me it brings to mind another reference to diamonds. I don't know whether you know the poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins, but one of them, his poems, ends with what might happen at the end of time. And he ends that poem, in a flash, at a trumpet crash, I am all at once what Christ is, since he was what I am. And this Jack, Joke, Potsherd, Patch, Matchwood, immortal diamond, is immortal diamond. Now I know that John Cottingham was taking a particular theme this morning, which, although I couldn't hear all of it, I have actually read in an excellent essay of his in this new book I mentioned called God, Goodness and Philosophy. And interestingly, I don't think he takes a fundamentally different line from Ronald Dworkin. He, like Ronald Dworkin, argues that there is this realm of moral discourse which is shared by believer and non-believer alike. They can use language to one another which both can understand. But John Cottingham goes on, I heard a bit of this, is that there's something more involved here, connected to the facts that words like truth, beauty and goodness have a certain authority. I don't know whether he used these words this morning, but these appear in his book. Truth is to be believed, beauty is to be admired, and goodness to be pursued. These imperatives, in a certain sense, constrain us, whether we like it or not. They have a magnetic quality, a kind of inbuilt to be pursuedness. And there's another essay in that book by by Roger Scruton, which again seems to indicate the same point. He talks about unchosen moral requirements. He says if you examine your own moral requirements, your obligations, that you find that there are some which are just there, which seem to be born as part of the society you there. You don't actually choose them, you recognize that they are there. And there's one other essay in that book that I want to mention, because it fits in with Euthyphro's dilemma that I suggested before. This suggests, and here we're getting rather technical theological language, ignore it if it's too much, but there is a technical theological term which talks about the simplicity of God. Now that doesn't mean that God is stupid. What it means is that the being or substance of God and the attributes or properties of God are identical. In Augustine's words, quod habet hoc est. God is what he has. In short, God is his goodness, his power, his love, and so on. Now, if this is true, it must mean that at a theoretical level, there can be absolutely no contradiction between the moral realm and the realm of God's transcendence, because God's being is his property or attributes. They are one. But nevertheless, of course, and this was another question this morning that I picked up, in practice, we're all aware, particularly at the moment, there is a very, very fierce debate between those people on the basis of their secular ethic take a moral judgment to bear against what is sometimes put forward as religious views. And the question this morning, I think, was about God ordering something immoral, like child sacrifice. Well, of course that's immoral. And I believe that we have to follow our best moral judgment and at all times and in all circumstances. And if you read a bit of the Bible and you think, well, God is commanding something very immoral, then you should trust your moral judgment. But what we're talking about, of course, we're talking about our own best understanding of what is right or wrong, and people's best understanding of what God wants, which is, sadly, has often been as wrong as it is right. We're talking about our very limited way of grappling with this. At the heart of the matter, theoretically, in terms, if you like, of the divine simplicity, there is no clash at all between God's goodness and God's being, because they are one and the same. But in this life, when we have this very, very finite, limited, partial view, of course, there will sometimes be that clash. But what I'd like to suggest is that when there is that clash, both sides, both the secular-based ethic, which is making moral judgments about religion, and the religiously-based ethic, actually have something to learn from each other. Take, for instance, the doctrine of hell. Now, F.D. Morris, a very distinguished professor in the 19th century, was sacked from his job at King's College London for disbelieving in the eternity of hell. And I think we would all say that it was very wrong to dismiss him. And most of us would find it very difficult to believe in a loving God who sentenced people to hell forever. We'd say that is immoral. But let's look at it another way. Well, I think we're all conscious that we can create our own hells. We can lock ourselves up with a sense of resentment, self-pity, bitterness. We can create our own hells. And if we are logically free, if we're free, then logically, of course, we're always free to create our own hells, even in the midst of heaven. So it may be that the language of hell is not totally absurd, and that we should resist simply what you might call a knee-jerk liberalism, say, well, all that's totally immoral. There may be something in this traditional language of hell which actually gets at a truth, that because we are free, genuinely free, we are free even to create our own hell in the midst of heaven. Now, of course, that's a very different understanding, a more moral understanding. But what I'm suggesting that just by one example, is that I think we need to avoid knee-jerk liberalism. There may be something in a traditional religious position which can deepen the whole debate for both sides of it. I think I want to stop pretty soon in order to open up for discussion. And I'm conscious that I haven't really got on to ways in which I think the Christian faith makes a difference. Perhaps let me just sum up very briefly and to say that in such a society as we have at the moment, of course there will be a great deal of overlap between a secular ethic and a Christian ethic. Because after all, Christian history, Christian